What no one on mainstream television is clearly explaining is this: when oil goes up to $10 a barrel, we're not just talking about numbers on a Wall Street screen. We're talking about your gas tank, the prices at the supermarket, the trucks that deliver food to your town, the bills you're going to pay next month. We're talking about a decision made in Washington that has direct consequences for every household in this country, and especially for Latino households that already know what it's like to bear the burden of an economy that wasn't designed to protect them. Trump just addressed the nation about the war with Iran, and instead of calming the markets, instead of providing a clear roadmap, instead of explaining how this conflict is going to end, he did the exact opposite. The markets crashed, oil prices skyrocketed, and millions of Americans woke up the next morning wondering what the hell is really going on with this war, with this economy, and with the future of a country that seems to be drifting ever deeper into a zone of profound uncertainty from which no one seems to have an honest way out. Look, when you observe this situation with the analytical distance it deserves, what you see isn't simply an oil crisis. What you see is a systemic crisis. It's the most recent manifestation of a contradiction that has been accumulating for decades at the heart of American capitalism and its foreign policy. And to understand it, you have to look at it from the beginning, from the fundamentals. Because if you only look at the day's headlines, if you only react to the number on the gas pump, then you're operating exactly as the system wants you to operate, reacting but without understanding. So let's start with the basics. On February 28th of this year, the United States and Israel launched coordinated attacks against Iran. That was over a month ago. Since then, the world has entered a new phase of geopolitical instability with implications that extend far beyond the Middle East. The U.S. responded by effectively closing the Strait of Hormuz, that narrow waterway barely 50 kilometers wide at its narrowest point, which before the war was the channel through which approximately 20% of the world's oil and liquefied natural gas passed. 20%. 1 out of every 5 barrels of oil moved on this planet passed through there. And now that is blocked. The number of tankers crossing the strait per day was approximately 50 before the war. This week, that number has fallen to 0 or nearly 0 for several days in a row. That is not an abstract statistic. That is a fracture in the backbone of the global energy supply. Since the war began on February 28th, the price of the U.S. benchmark crude, West Texas Intermediate, has risen by more than 50%. Brent crude, the international benchmark, has increased by almost 60%. And when Trump gave his speech Wednesday night, instead of presenting a plan to open the strait or a concrete roadmap for a ceasefire, what the market heard was ambiguity, uncertainty, and more promises of bombing. The day after the speech, Brent crude rose more than 8% to surpass $109 a barrel, while the U.S. benchmark crude climbed nearly 13% to $113. And here's the point I think is crucial. The markets didn't react this way because they're irrational. The markets reacted this way because Trump's speech didn't offer what was needed to quell the fear. What the market wanted was a clear framework for a ceasefire, a date, a mechanism, something concrete. What it got was a president saying the war will last 2 or 3 more weeks, that they're going to hit Iran extremely hard, and that the strait will open naturally, as if closing the most important energy artery on the planet were a problem that solves itself, without strategy, without real diplomacy, without a plan. Buyers of physical barrels of U.S. crude oil were willing to pay nearly $10 in Houston, a premium of about $5 over the May futures contract. And one of the most respected analysts on this issue, John Kildew, founding partner of Agen Capital, was absolutely blunt. The speech was a disaster. This wasn't said by a left-wing critic. It was said by someone who lives off the energy market, someone who needs things to work to make money. Now, what does this mean for Americans who live in this country, for working people, for Latino families filling up their gas tanks to get to work? The average price of gasoline in the United States has already surpassed $10 per gallon, which hasn't happened since 2022. Diesel, the fuel that powers the trucks delivering produce to supermarkets, the fuel that powers the farm machinery producing food, has risen to 545 per gallon, more than $80 higher than it was a year ago. That's not some abstract number in an economic report. That's the price the truck driver pays to move the goods. That's the cost that's passed directly on to the price of beans, rice, milk, and diapers. And those costs, as always happens in capitalism, aren't paid by the shareholder. They're paid by the worker. Analysts project that retail gasoline prices in the United States could reach between 4.25 and 445 cents per gallon in the next 2 weeks at the current rate, and diesel could climb even higher. This has a direct impact on inflation because when diesel goes up, everything goes up. Transporting goods becomes more expensive, and that cost reaches every family's table. Bank of America analysts have predicted that inflation, as measured by the Federal Reserve's Preferred Index, the PCE, is about to surge and reach almost 4% this quarter. Recall that this index stood at 2.8% in January. We're talking about a significant jump in a very short period, and those who are going to feel it the hardest are exactly those who always feel the economic blows first in this country: low-income workers, immigrants, communities of color, the working class that doesn't have a financial cushion to absorb these shocks. But there's something deeper I want us to consider together, and that's the question of the narrative the administration is trying to construct around all of this. White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt has called the recent surge in oil and gasoline prices temporary, insisting that once the goals of Operation Epic Fury are achieved, Americans will see oil and gas prices plummet. Temporary, that's the magic word. It's always temporary. When the banks collapsed in 2008 and millions of Americans lost their homes, it was temporary. When the pandemic destroyed millions of jobs, it was temporary. When inflation in 2022 hit everyone's wallets, it was temporary. And now, when a war in the Middle East is shutting off the flow of 20% of the world's oil, it's also being called temporary. The problem with that narrative is that temporary, in practice, can mean months or years of real suffering for real people. The president of the European Central Bank, Christine Lagarde, in a recent interview with The Economist, called market expectations of a quick recovery from the war with Iran overly optimistic, saying there's no way the lost energy supply from the Gulf can be restored in a matter of months, and warning that the disruption could last for years, not weeks, not the couple of weeks Trump is promising, but years. And when the head of Europe's most important central bank says something like that, you have to take it seriously because she has no political incentive to exaggerate the problem. Quite the opposite. And then you ask yourself, what's really going on here? Why was the decision made to start this war on February 28th? What's the logic behind an attack that shuts down 20% of the world's energy supply? It triggers inflation. One of the markets is putting millions of jobs at risk and has no exit plan. Of course, these are the questions that honest analysis demands, and they are questions that the mainstream media rarely ask with the depth they deserve. Let's look at Trump's speech with a critical eye. Trump said in his speech Wednesday night that they are going to hit Iran extremely hard over the next 2 or 3 weeks and push them back to the Stone Age where they belong. That is not the language of a statesman seeking a diplomatic resolution. That is showmanship. It is language designed for a domestic audience, to show strength, to project toughness. But the problem is that the world doesn't work like a television show. Iran's armed forces responded with a warning of more crushing, wider, and more destructive attacks to come. That, too, is not showmanship. That is a strategic response from a state that is being bombed and that has real capabilities to continue doing damage. More than 40 countries participated in a virtual meeting to discuss all possible methods for fully opening the Strait of Hormuz. But the meeting ended without a concrete plan. The French president dismissed Trump's call for allies to unblock the waterway by force. European countries have said they will only help secure the strait if there is a ceasefire. And here lies the central contradiction of Trump's strategy. He calls on his allies to act, but he doesn't give them the necessary political conditions to be able to act. He says the strait will open naturally, but the strait doesn't open just because Trump wants it to. It opens when there is a political agreement, and that political agreement requires exactly what Trump seems incapable or unwilling to do: real negotiations with real concessions. UN Security Council Resolution 2817, adopted on March 11th, called on Iran to immediately refrain from actions or threats aimed at closing or obstructing navigation through the strait. Iran has not complied with the resolution. International law exists on paper. The reality in the Gulf is quite different, and as long as theory and reality don't align, oil will continue to cost what it costs, and American families will continue to pay the price. Now I'd like to talk about something that's almost entirely absent from standard media coverage: the impact of this war on the developing world, on the most vulnerable countries. The United Nations Development Program has warned that up to 4 million people could be pushed into poverty in Arab nations as a result of the war. Middle Eastern nations could lose between 3.7 and 6% of their total gross domestic product, the equivalent of between $120 and $194 billion, with unemployment in the region projected to rise by 4%. But let's think beyond the directly affected region.